Okay, here's Spatial Shark with Unit 5. This is video number 4, and this focus will be on the commercial side of agriculture. The last video we were talking only about the subsistence varieties of farming around the world, and now this time we're going to be talking about the food that is going to be sold rather than consumed by the people who are growing it. So this commercial agricultural system that exists in the world today really has its roots in the mercantilist European colonial imperial model that began after the 1500s. If you go make a connection back to Unit 4, this is about that time that Wallerstein proposes is the beginnings of this core periphery, kind of a three-tiered system where the richer countries are controlling those that are less developed. And so when you see a modern commercial agricultural system, we still today derive a tremendous amount of, especially luxury crops, from the poorest countries, and then we export, they export, we import those items into the United States. And you could make the case, for example, coffee is a great example. In many areas of the world, these economic relationships are kind of neo-colonial. Rather than these countries being politically controlled, they're now being economically manipulated. Many of their economies are almost solely based on the export of these crops. The global market dictates the price of the product. They really don't have a lot of control over pricing. They sometimes try to form cartels so that they can somewhat control their own destiny economically and financially. But so many of these corporations that are involved, sometimes these corporations have budgets that are bigger than the GDP of the countries that they're dealing with. So these companies have tremendous influence, tremendous power. And this has been true historically as well as in the modern day. If you want to search up an interesting case, look up the United Fruit Company and their dealings in Central America, particularly in Guatemala, throughout the 1930s and 50s and 70s, and look at why we talk about, for example, banana republics in Latin America. I'll show you a couple things here today. If you like Nutella, stay tuned. So when we think about these horizontally or vertically integrated businesses that are engaged in farming, so many of the food that you walk through the grocery store, you think of it as being thousands and thousands of companies, but really the control is only by a handful of big, gigantic food companies, Kraft and Kellogg's and Nabisco and even Pepsi and Coke. They don't just make carbonated beverages. There's a lot of food products that they control. So we think about these commodity chains. Sometimes in the David Palmer Blue Book, he talks about cool chains where things have to be kept refrigerated. But this really is an economy driven by consumer demand. And so I was mentioning all of these companies that are involved in food. And this chart, really, it's not even just all food companies. This is just those that are getting involved in organic. As organic has become increasingly popular in the United States because of health consciousness and affluence, as more incomes are rising, so many of these regular food companies have just rushed to get into the organic game. And so a lot of times you guys will look at this, you'll notice that you recognize many of these companies, but you may not have known that they are owned by larger food companies. You think Heinz and you think of ketchup. You think of Kraft, you think of mac and cheese. Nestle is chocolate or cocoa. Kellogg's is cereal only. But you would be surprised how many other companies they've been buying. And this chart, while a little bit outdated, it's now more than a decade old. Spatial Shark should probably refresh this page. But it gives you an idea of what we mean when we say that these companies are horizontally or vertically integrated. Remember, horizontal integration, they own many levels of the same, many companies at the same level of an industry. If it's vertically integrated, the same company is controlling everything, the forward linkages and the backward linkages, all the way from the production through the manufacturing, the distribution, the retail, and the consumption of the product. And that's more like McDonald's. McDonald's is the biggest buyer of potatoes in America, the biggest buyer of beef in America. They control the shipping of the product. Obviously, they own the restaurants. They do the marketing. Everything is McDonald's top to bottom. That's a very good vertical integration example. When you think about Nutella, this is kind of vertical as well. And Nutella is the brand name. The company is the Ferrero Group. You may know at holiday time, a lot of people love these little Ferrero Rocher candies that are wrapped in the little gold leaf paper. But essentially, this is a product that works off of one major resource, and that is hazelnuts. Originally, these hazelnuts were sourced in Italy itself, which is where the company is based. Lately, they've shifted their origin of the hazelnut to Turkey. There are some geopolitical issues going on, as well as some, other physical problems. The hazelnut crop is not as, big as it used to be, and therefore the company is somewhat in a pinch in terms of pricing, in terms of getting that product. But obviously, you need the cocoa, you need the sugar, you need the palm oil, the vanilla. And Madagascar is typically a very big source of vanilla, but again, some big problems with vanilla production there. West Africa, always big for cacao, for cocoa production. Not just Nigeria, but Ivory Coast and Ghana, other countries here in West Africa. But you'll notice they have to then ship all those raw materials, all of those agricultural products to their factories. There's one in North America. They are distributed throughout the world, and Nutella is a very popular product. Again, particularly in Europe, you can see the real concentration there. Of course, the company again based in Italy, but this is a great example of a vertically integrated company where you see that they control everything from the sourcing of the raw material, the resource, all the way through the manufacturing and through the distribution and the retail. They have their sales offices, for example, one in New York City. And so when you see this Nutella value chain or commodity chain, you get the idea of what we're talking about with these vertically or horizontally integrated companies. Remember, I said that this is a demand-driven economy in terms of commercial agriculture. This is a great preview for you ninth graders of what you're going to have to do when you get to your senior year and you're taking your AP economics courses. So a big joke we always, I think I laugh when you think about economists, and they always call these curves, but they're more like straight lines. But they always say that, economists love models because models supply the curves that economists demand. And you think about that for a second. But when the demand goes up, right, and rises up here to the right, what's going to happen to the price point is it's going to go along this supply curve, assuming that supply stays the same. If demand increases, the price is going to go up, right? If the demand drops and comes this way, down and left, same supply is assumed. If this demand drops, the price is going to fall. By the same token, let's say that there's a shortage of hazelnuts for Nutella. So the supply curve is going to move up and left, which is a decrease for that curve. If demand stays the same, but supply is being reduced, again, the price is going to go up. And also, if they source new hazelnuts or chocolate or vanilla or whatever, that supply would increase, move out to the right, the supply curve, and therefore, again, price would drop because assuming that demand stays the same. What if demand and supply both go up? Well, you can again plot it out on your chart here. If the demand increases, but also the supply increases, price might actually stay about the same. So when you get to 12th grade, you really talk about the supply and demand curve, but this is a super simplistic version of it. And certainly the David Palmer Blue Book does a great job of describing that as well. So commercial agriculture in the more developed countries of the world today. We're going to talk about von Thunen in just a second. We sometimes call him the Lord of the Rings because his model looks like a concentric set of circles or rings. And I'll actually show you a map of the United States, and we'll look at some real world applicability of von Thunen. But you need to know that the von Thunen ring is all about commercial agriculture, nothing about subsistence whatsoever. And certainly, you know, that the Western hemisphere tends to be way more commercial and way more extensive, whereas Asian farming tends to be intensive. Remember, we talked about rice yesterday, the most intensively sedentary grown crop in the world. And I actually sent you guys a picture through Google Classroom of some of the rice terracing in Bali in Indonesia. So again, great example. So essentially what we look at here is we're looking at a von Thunian pattern. He wrote a book or did an essay basically about this in 1826 where he talked about the isolated state. And he said that the assumption is that there's a central market and that all farmers are going to sell their crop. And they had to think about the cost of the land and the transportation cost of their product. Clearly, the farmer has to sell the food for a price higher than the cost of the land itself and the cost of getting the product to the market. Now, remember, you're talking 1826. So refrigeration is not existing yet. This is all going to be fresh. It's all going to be organically grown. There were no chemical pesticides and fertilizers at that time. Irrigation would have been much more simpler, technologically speaking. The machinery would not be there yet. He assumes that all farmers are going to transport in a wooden wagon driven by 2 oxen, no roads, it's flat terrain. There's all kinds of assumptions we're going to talk about in a second. But you need to know he basically only considered these 2 costs. The bid rent for the land itself, it's kind of like monopoly. There's a price on all the properties, but if you play by the actual rules, if the player doesn't want to buy it for that price, then it goes to auction and everybody can drive up the bid rent. They can bid higher for the property. Again, supply and demand. The land that's closer to the market would be more in demand, and the land that's farther away would be less in demand, and therefore the bid rent is a big concept in human geography. We'll see this all throughout the urban chapter as well. So the idea is that the farmers are going to want to grow something that brings in more money than the cost of the land plus the cost of the transportation. Don't forget, again, 1826 perishability was a very real issue. Today, these cool chains mean that perishability is not so much of a problem. And that's why I told you guys the other day, if you look at some of your dairy products, you're going to find out they might come from Idaho. And actually, we might do a little fun homework assignment, a little website called Where Is Your Milk From? And you'll have to go and look at the dairy code on your product and find out where it was produced. Crops that are grown closer to the market have to be more intensive. They have to be more profitable. Land use farther from the market can be extensive because that property, that land is less per acre, per square mile, per hectare, whatever you're measuring it by, because that land is farther away. Therefore, the crops that are grown on it have to be more sturdy, more hardy, less perishable, and the land itself is going to be cheaper. So the most intensive thing you'll see close to the market is horticulture, fruits and veggies, market gardening, dairy products. And so this is what you see a lot of times in big cities is you'll see a lot of fruits and vegetables. In today's world, some of this can be imported and exotic. In von Thunen's world, this would have all been locally sourced produce that was available for the people who lived in that village or town. So this is what we mean by that land or bid rent curve. And like I said, we'll do this a lot more when we get to urban geography. But essentially, in today's modern world, the farther you get from your optimum location, and they sometimes have what they call PLVI, the peak land value intersection, the most desirable place in the urban area. That's where rents are going to be the highest. The tallest buildings, the big hotels and the bank buildings and the skyscrapers, insurance companies, and, tall buildings always mean money. And the farther you get from that peak land value intersection, the less intensive the land use becomes, the more extensive, less density, residences closer to the city are more like condos, apartments, residences farther away are like suburbs. And again, agriculture, more intensive, closer to the market, more extensive, farther from the market. market. Nothing is less intensive or more extensive than animal herding. That takes up a lot of space. Those animals need a lot of room, unless of course it's a CAFO where you're putting 10,000 cows in one pen and force feeding them corn. So read through this. This is all of von Thunen's assumptions. Central located market, no external influences. Remember, he called it the isolated state. This word isotropic, flat and featureless. Make sure you know those two words. An isotropic terrain, so we don't have any problems with rivers or mountains or any kind of obstacles to the transportation. Soil quality, climate, all consistent. Everything has to be equal. Remember, when you do an experiment, you have to hold all your variables the same except what you're trying to measure, which is your control variable. And so farmers are going to transport the goods directly to the market, and the greater the distance, the greater the cost, right? Clearly. And so farmers will always act to maximize their income. So this is essentially what von Thunen's rings look like. And I have superimposed the cost per acre of the land. If you're in the market itself, the land is the most expensive. The farther you get from the market, the cost of the land decreases in all directions, right? In all directions. So assuming a flat, featureless, isotropic surface, all you have to figure out is that closer to the market is going to be the things that are the most perishable because they cost the most if they spoil. You earn no money if your milk is rotten. Then there's usually a forest belt, and then you've got the grains and the livestock farthest away. So if you look at this blank map of the United States, if we were to make a super simplistic, massively hypothetical U.S. market, if we had a single market, think about where it would be. If you think about New York City, our largest urban area, how would von Thunian patterns be apparent? Check this out. Again, oversimplified. We get that there's going to be tons of exceptions here. And we get that you could make rings off of Chicago or Atlanta or Miami or Houston or Los Angeles. Yes, you can make all these rings and you could do the exact same image. But if this was a central market of New York, you should have dairy and market gardening closest to that market. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but look at New Jersey's license plates. It says the Garden State. Shut the front door, right? You mean it's market gardening for New York? Look at the dairy of upstate New York, right? All of this is a von Thunian pattern. You would have this kind of forest belt in the middle here, as well as farther away. A lot of products that are grown in here, not really food agricultural products. Corn and soybeans throughout the Midwest. Remember, the states that begin with the letter I are big corn producers. Another wheat belt further out, and then your livestock, your cows, and those kinds of products. Again, you could do this same kind of a system and you could work it off of Miami. There's a lot of dairies that were in South Florida. Ives Dairy Road is a legacy of that. You've got the fruits and veggies all up and down 441 through Broward and Palm Beach County. So there's your intensive market gardening, your truck farming. As you get up into Central Florida, you're going to get your fruits, citrusy type crops. A lot of cattle up around Orlando. Kissimmee, for example, one of the biggest rodeos in the southeastern United States. So you could do the same von Thunian pattern. Again, really oversimplistic. Today's modern world, there's tons of exceptions, especially because of refrigeration and trucking that can move the product so much faster, so much more efficiently. But there's still a lot of usefulness in this idea of these von Thunian patterns. Okay, we slightly went over 15 minutes, but this was super, super important to talk about the Lord of the Rings here. So I'll try to close it out, and this will be your fourth video in Unit 5. Coming back soon, we're going to be talking about the Green Revolution.